Struggles in the world.
This is Women in Focus, a series about women, created and produced by women, and presented by the Women's Office at UBC.
Once upon a time, there was a charming young woman called Cinderella, who was a social disaster until she got a few lessons in the seductive powers of dress from her fairy godmother. Soon after that, she met a rich and handsome young prince who had a raging foot fetish. As luck would have it, Cinders had just the kind of feet he was looking for, and they lived happily ever after. Which all goes to show just how important clothes can be. In the early 1850s, when women of the leisure classes first started immigrating to Canada in large numbers, clothing hardly revealed that women had feet, and there are recorded cases of Victorian males fainting away at the sight of a naked female ankle. These illustrations are from Godey's Ladies magazine, which was widely read in Upper Canada at that time, and helped to set the standard of what would be worn by the wives and daughters of the military men and government officials who made up the fashionable elite of Upper and Lower Canada. The skirt shape was created by horsehair padding and layers of petticoats, sometimes quilted, in winter and always heavy to drag around. The waist was highly tightly laced with bone corsets, and since it was vulgar for a woman to raise her arms, except when dancing, dress armholes were cut low and tight, with sloping shoulders, and feet were forced into the narrowest, smallest boots. Among the leisure classes, women were adored but untouchable, and placed on pedestals as revered symbols of prestige. Their interests were restricted fairly much to social affairs, occasional good words, and the changing whims of fashion. A woman kept by the males of her family performed her function, which was simply to please, not by doing anything, but by looking attractive. She was a luxury on whom a man spent extravagantly because she was a symbol of his social and economic status. By keeping up with changing fashions, she constantly attested to his financial success. And if fashion made her helpless so that she even needed help to put her clothes on, or lift things out of eye-level cupboards, so much the better. If she couldn't move because of what she was wearing, she was in a state of total submission, and that was great for the male ego. Later in this decade and into the 60s, the skirt padding was replaced by cumbersome hoops or a cage of whalebone or metal wire, which removed some of the weight. It also enabled skirts to become larger still, sometimes 5 yards in circumference. These new cage crinolines, which swayed provocatively, giving an occasional glimpse of a well-shod foot or petticoat, made any waist seem small, and tight lacing loosened off just a bit. But mass production made cheap copies of the crinoline available to almost all social classes. Women working in a Toronto crinoline factory earned up to $5 a week, while the article retailed for about $1.50. Because the rich wanted to look different from the lower classes, a new look soon emerged, with a gradual shifting of emphasis onto the buttocks. This new look, the bustle, was one of supposed dignity, in contrast with the romanticism of the crinoline. This fast turnover of fashion, causing clothing to be discarded before it's worn out, keeps clothing manufacturers rubbing their hands with glee as women's bodies aspire to changing shapes and ideals. The large department stores of the 1850s sent their buyers to Europe to ensure their customers the very latest in fashionable dress. And Susanna Moodie, writing of life in the clearings versus the bush, was prompted to comment.
In Canada, they carried this imitation of the fashions of the day to extremes not found in England. If a lady was ever so stout, that circumstance would not prevent her from wearing half a dozen more skirts than was necessary, because that absurd and unhealthy practice has for a long period prevailed. And if green was the prevailing color, every lady would adopt it, whether it suited her complexion or not.
The male historian J.M. Gibbons suggests that the introduction of the bustle by a large Montreal department store successfully distracted the attention of the fair sex from too much concern of the problems of confederation. Certainly many men have liked to think that women were too impressionable and flighty, or alternatively, too fine and noble, for business, politics, or intellectual pursuits. In some ways, changing fashions have helped to support these myths because men have enjoyed satirizing fashionable women. Many men have never wanted their wives to look any different from the wives of their colleagues, never given much support for dress reform, and for as long as they could treat fashion as a joke, they could unconsciously build up their own sense of importance. The new straightened dress front once again inhibited the movement of the legs, and tight lacing came back with a vengeance. A man would find it totally disarming if his hands met around a woman's waist. During this whole Victorian era, prudery was thought to be a great virtue in a woman. The body was well concealed, and some of its erotic attraction became transferred to clothing. Things like trousers and drawers were unmentionable, and even table and piano legs were kept covered. A nice woman shunned all knowledge of her body, was delicate in health, avoided physical exercise and draughts, drank vinegar to cultivate a pale, delicate complexion, and was thought to be interesting if she was subject to fainting fits. The Industrial Revolution caused the middle classes to grow. As men became wealthier, many wives aspired to interesting respectability through fashion. If it was suspected by doctors that fainting fits were in any way caused by tight lacing, they kept their opinions to themselves. More popular was the notion that women might have skipped a stage in their evolution, and therefore needed the support of a good corset to keep them upright. At the same time, there was thought to be a strong connection between morality and inner discipline, and a well-laced body, and for as long as this idea persisted, as it did until after the First World War, it has been hard for respectable women to shed their corsets.
Let's take a look at the effect the corset had on the shape of a woman's anatomy. I'm standing normally. Notice the way my stomach muscles move as I breathe. The corset applied pressure to this whole area, restricting the waist and forcing the back into a curve, with the breast and buttocks thrust out, and forcing these stomach and pelvic muscles here, which are important to breathing, to become restricted and ineffective. The chest and the rib cage were raised, and the head became raised in a high position that gives the supposed dignity of the posture. Notice how the breathing is now forced to take place in the upper chest. It's a quick, panting, panic breathing, because not enough oxygen reached the brain. Fainting fits were common, and over a long period, brain damage could occur. This kind of breathing, when we would feel panicky, fragile, and over-anxious, since restrictions of dress lead to physical and psychological conditions, they would really be the delicate creatures they were expected to be. It didn't do the internal organs a lot of good either to be pushed out of shape, and aches and pains abounded. The slightest S shape put the whole of the weight onto the back and the small of the body, pinching the discs between the vertebrae, so that severe back problems were common from middle age onwards. But then every occupation has its hazards. Canada, of course, wasn't totally the domain of middle-class businessmen and military government officials. In fact, by Confederation in 1867, Canada was 80% rural, with 80% of the population living in Upper and Lower Canada. The settlers, especially in the early days, couldn't afford the luxury of being unable to participate in daily life because of restricted clothing. Men and women worked alongside each other, clearing the land, with the help of the Indians, who taught them to make buckskin clothing and to eat new foods like beaver tails and moose snout. Many of them learned to be totally self-supporting. In a book called Canadian Scenery, published in 1842, N.P. Willis discusses the importance of good health and abilities with the backwoods settler's wife.
Her skill is shown in the arts of manufacturing maple syrup, candle and soap making, baking, cooking, salting meat and fish, knitting socks and mittens, spinning woolen yarns, feeding poultry, managing a dairy, and mostly in mending and making clothes for herself, her husband, and her children. These are the occupations of an immigrant's wife. And if a female cannot resolve to enter upon them cheerfully, she should never think of settling in the woods of Canada or New Brunswick.
Once life became a little more secure, fashion was reserved for the best silk dress, often selected from the Eaton's catalogue, and the pride of every woman who owned one. It served for many seasons, supported beneath by homemade corset copies from patterns given in journals. Some socially conscious mothers, hoping for a less hard life for their daughters, gave them an education that stressed the social graces and forced them into corsets at 13 years old, and to ensure that they didn't undo the laces, tied their hands at night. Because of the shortage of women in Canada, they were married off early. If a woman wasn't married by the time she was 24 years old, she was considered an old maid at a time when marriage was considered a woman's duty. Eligible women were enticed to Canada on bride ships, with assurances of marriage within 6 months. Because she was so beautiful, 13-year-old Isabel Curtis was advised to wear a veil when she disembarked at Victoria in 1862, along a gangplank lined with anxious bachelors. Throughout this period, there was a large supply of manuals giving advice on how to choose a socially acceptable wife. Here's a quote for Searchlights on Health, Light and Dark Corners by B.J. Jeffries, which is obviously not aimed at the settler.
Small feet and small ankles are very attractive because they're in harmony with the perfect female form, and men admire perfection. Small feet and ankles indicate modesty and reserve, while large feet and ankles indicate coarseness, physical power, authority, and predominance.
And from books like Henry Fink's Romantic Love and Personal Beauty, the bridegroom could learn suitable behavior in the treatment of his bride.
A lover should not hold the bride by the ears in kissing her, as appears to have been the custom at weddings in the last century. A more graceful way, and quite as effective in preventing the bride from getting away, is to put your fingers under her chin and gently but firmly press your lips on hers. After a few repetitions, she will find that it does not hurt, and she will become as docile as a lamb.
The wedding dress would rarely have been white for the settler's wife. She would instead have chosen something practical, which could have been saved for best, but worn regularly. Perhaps something like this. In the 1870s, marriage ended a woman's legal identity. She couldn't control or transfer property, sue or be sued. All her belongings, including her children, were the property of her husband, and she had no way of becoming free of him. Mail-order brides were common, especially in the more westerly settled areas where life was hard and primitive. Red River was the only large settlement in the West, and women so rare that they were stared at whenever they walked the planked streets. The settlers lived in sod hovels under appalling social conditions, with bathing facilities, glass windows, and other amenities only developing with the coming of women. Homemade whiskey, a common breakfast drink, cost 25 cents a gallon, and before women's involvement made the temperance movement effective, total abstainers were thought to have something wrong with them and to be poor insurance risks. The wagon trains of the 70s crossed the prairies at 10 miles an hour, carrying middle-class families westward from Upper Canada. They tended to be morally upstanding and religious lot, and their arrival had a chilling effect on the moral climate of the West. With them came the blossoming of prairie society in the emerging cities, with engraved invitations to receptions and ceremonial dinners, which the ladies attended wearing elaborately trimmed imported gowns, and moccasins, dancing slippers being unobtainable. By the end of the 70s, long tight skirts revealed the shape of the hips at the front for the first time in 100 years. At the back, however, huge buttocks grew and grew for a decade under skirts that stood at right angles to the waist. A guide for corseting was an inch for every year at the age of marriage, with an ideal waist being about 16 to 17 inches. It was in the 80s that clothes started to be influenced by the entry of large numbers of middle-class women into the workforce. The writing machine had recently been invented, and since women were cheaper to employ than men, the typewriter soon became a symbol of their emancipation. They needed practical clothing, and the look they turned to a tailored jacket with more practical skirt and blouse beneath showed the influence of men's clothing in its cut. Even more emancipating to women than the typewriter was the bicycle craze of the 1890s. Although denounced as a tool of the devil and an undoubted threat to the future of the race, the wheel was incredibly popular. At first, modest women tied their skirt hems to their shoes. Later, ignoring accusations that they were fastened and immoral, they donned trouser suits inspired by Amelia Bloomer, and the lower limbs gradually began to be shown without embarrassment. The bike, of course, had its greatest popularity in the cities, where people could afford them, and where paved roads were more common. Women enjoyed the new sense of physical freedom that bicycle riding gave them, along with the exhilaration of physical exercise, mobility, and free movement of the limbs. At the turn of the century, Canada was a sparsely populated land. Prairie farms were so isolated that sometimes neighboring women would pound corn at prearranged times just to be able to hear each other in the distance. Thousands of young women came out to Canada to work as domestics. Household help was a necessity rather than a luxury. Servants could command good salaries, especially where living conditions were underdeveloped and old country class distinctions often became impractical.
I felt my English blood almost boil in my veins when I found myself sitting in company with two servant women. I could have very well accommodated myself to such neighbors in the States, but never expected to have found the leveling system introduced in the British provinces to such an extent.
In the West, however, prostitution was the major occupation for women, with, in dry areas, bootleg liquor providing a lucrative sideline. Gallons could be smuggled under an expansive bustle. There was such a shortage of labor in general that orphans, delinquents, and the maladjusted were shipped out from English institutions to provide free and unsupervised farm labor. And in New Brunswick, the poor were auctioned out to the highest bidder. For the native peoples of Canada, this era was a sad one. The Hudson's Bay had tried to control the Indians for over 200 years by restricting the range of trading goods. They were allowed Hudson's Bay blankets, rifles, staples, colored handkerchiefs, and baubles, but were denied luxuries like sewing machines because it was feared that a wider range of material goods would drive up the fur prices. The growth of the white civilization, by forcing the Indians off their lands, eroded the social and economic basis of Indian culture, and many people were reduced to poverty. For others, the importance of the ceremonial dress diminished, and native women began to aspire to new imported fashionable ideals. Even the more isolated Eskimo groups were not immune, though in winter dress, women continued to be differentiated from men by a front flap. Summer dress became more obviously influenced. The misery of the poor hardly touched the affluent city folk, where the car was having an uplifting effect on the hemline, to leave feet free to reach the pedals. The latest fashionable look was typified by a distinctive S shape. This was inspired by King Edward, who favored cool, commanding, mature women with heavy busts, and was accentuated by the new health corset, which held the body straight and rigid at the front, throwing out the bust and the hips in an attempt to prevent pressure on the abdomen. To support the neck, boning was often used in collars. Thanks to advances in manufacturing, this period boasted the tightest lacing ever, making the dress of the leisure class impractical for ever-increasing numbers of women. By 1911, 2 million women were working outside the home. With the First World War, even more of them were called upon to take the place of absent men, in war relief, munitions, farms, factories, offices, and banks. The war had a restraining influence on fashion, but clothing became increasingly less restrictive to accommodate the requirements of workers. There was a desire in this era to throw off conventions, especially those concerned with the war, and fashion began to represent more liberal social attitudes. The vote had been won in most provinces, sex was no longer unmentionable, and a kiss no longer meant a proposal. The ideal shape was that of a cylinder. Tight lacing was at last discarded in favor of a long, elastic girdle that gave an uncorseted look, and the breasts were bound flat. Focus was on the legs and the face. The latest look in hats was the cloche. The big hats of the early 20s gave way to a tight-fitting hat more suited to car riding, but adopted by all social classes. And because of the fit, most women cut off their long hair. Makeup was now widely used, and for the first time it was acceptable to apply it in public. A craze for sunbathing towards the end of the 20s and into the 30s led to backs being bared. Skirts reached their highest in 1927. Smoking was considered rather naughty, but it became a symbol of women's emancipation. The same decade that heralded nail polish and jazz also saw the Methodists raise their ban on dancing. And in 1929, women finally became persons within the meaning of the British North America Act. Cloth was cut on the bias so that dresses revealed every movement of the body. The fit was tight across the hips, helped by latex corsets, and the bra became increasingly popular as a breast support. Hemlines went down, partly because of pressure from clothing manufacturers, and partly because of a growing paternalism seen in the Depression and in the growth of Hitler's popularity in Europe. Men wanted the jobs and wanted their women to look feminine again. Not only do clothes keep us warm and protected, they express our individual and personal statements about who we are and what we do. At the same time, on a broader level, reflect the social and economic conditions of a period. After wars and depressions, women's clothes have frequently become more restrictive than it was. What we hope we've shown you is that clothes have played an important role in shaping people's experiences and expectations. In the history of fashionable women, this has sometimes been taken to painful and physically harmful extremes, to which women had to submit if they wished to maintain their position and their friends. Now that we understand the process better and are taking a more active role in shaping our own history, we're better able to participate in the process that concerns the shaping of our bodies.
I remember one outfit that I had made for a formal affair. Very expensive. I had my hair done in these ringlets and you couldn't move, you know, but they had to cover one eye because I could only put the false eyelashes on properly on one eye, so I had to have my hair over the other eye so that you couldn't see the, like, misapplied false eyelash. And these ringlets and hairspray, like, you know, and a dress that was like China doll. It was the era of the ruffle. So there was like ruffles so that your neck was like never relaxed, and it was very, very tight fitting with this stupid little skirt that just sort of came to where if you bent too much in any one direction, did funny things and was too revealing. And it was too tight so that you had to wear, like, always wore a girdle, panty girdle in those days. It was before the era of pantyhose. So there was always a girdle, never had a garter belt because of, fat. And it was a very, very uncomfortable evening from the point of view of, like, physical comfort. But I remember being very psychologically comfortable because I knew that it really looked great. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I wasn't even aware that I was uncomfortable. Like, that's how bad it was. Like, it was so important. The other thing about looking right was so important that you weren't even aware that you were constricted. Like, you didn't even know that you couldn't move. You just could, you didn't even want to, I guess, because you had to sit there and look nice. And that was all that was required of you. You didn't have to do anything.
This has been Women in Focus, a series about women, created and produced by women, and presented by the Women's Office at UBC.
Because a woman